Welcome to Saw Everything Training, where I talk training models, I'll do workouts and stuff, and I write programs. So, if any of that suits your fancy, subscribe, and I'll likely have some content for you. Today, we're going to talk about my current training model that we've been building in Dr. Pat Davidson's Program Design Mentorship. I'm going to start by quickly covering the critique that I've used to, judge my current training model as well as others in the group. And during my talk on the training model, I'd like you to keep the criteria in mind. And if anything comes to mind, whether that be questions, comments, concerns, or critique on my model, please comment down below. I'd love to have a conversation with you or just hear your thoughts. So to be brief, I have these broken into two categories: our non-negotiables on the left in green and our qualitative improvements on the right in purple. So to go through our non-negotiables, a training model needs to have training principles, needs to have a way of acquiring relevant information, so it needs analysis. It needs a progression or regression based on that information. So an if this, then that scenario. It needs a way of track relevant information, data, that would be relevant towards the individual's goals. So tracking. And it needs to be reproducible. So can your training model write 3 different programs for 3 different people and 2 of them having the same goals? For our qualitative criteria, is your model organized? Is it teachable? Do you have some form of citation or breadcrumb trail for the acquisition of information? And is it appealing? So this is the criteria that I use to judge mine as well as other members in the group's training model. So please keep these in mind as we go through my model. I have my model broken into 4 primary buckets with my program building or tracking off to the side here. So we have bucket number 1 being training principles, number 2 is your client considerations, 3 would be program considerations, and 4 would be recovery. So the big picture here is principles. What are my railroad tracks? Client considerations. This is my way of acquiring needs analysis. What information am I able to track and what matters? Programming considerations. These would be my if this then that scenarios. So based on my needs analysis information, where can I put them in this essentially flow chart that they would progress towards their goals? And then recovery, that would kind of be environmental constraints. So where can I work with this individual for setting them up for success around the clock as opposed to just during the training time? So to start us off, what is this model capable of doing? Acquire appropriate and useful lifestyle and performance information to track reference for training. Determine performance limiting factors for both movement quality and energy production, how to influence them and progress them, and determine ranges to train specific qualities of fitness. So acquire information and actually act on it. So our needs analysis. Determine limiting factors for movement as well as performance. So that's my if this then that. Determine ranges to train specific qualities of fitness. Those would be like your training principles. And then my perceived limitations, proxies for transitions and deloads. So we'll see as I go over the program, but something I feel I fall short on is having proxies for, when to transition things. As we look at our principles, these would kind of be your 4 primary principles you'd see in most exercise science textbooks. We have specificity, overload, individual difference, and reversibility. You need to be specific to reach a goal. You need to increase the work over time to help you reach that goal. Individual differences need to be accounted for, whether it be environmental constraints, movement capacity, quality, coordination, attention span, many details. And reversibility, so anything that can be trained can also detrain. My philosophies, these would be more or less my personal training principles, but a little more on the abstract side. Seek to best replicate the qualities you want to be able to express. As to say, set yourself up for success. If you want to be strong, then seek to best replicate that quality. Lift something really heavy, give yourself lots of rest, and you're probably only going for a few short reps. So set yourself up for success. Number 2, seek to build an environment to most accurately require the specimen you want to be. So our environmental constraints are all going to have an impact on, us. A training program is no more than manipulating your current environment to try and produce a different you, hopefully the one that reaches you towards your goals. So the more of our environment we can manipulate that would require the person we are with our goals, the more accurate our training is going to be along the lines. Number 3, there's a time and place to clear a path and the time and place to run from a bear. So I walked into a fresh jungle with a machete and I'm going to clear a nice looking trail all the way down. There's a bear or jaguar at the end, and now I can run like hell without worried about tripping on twigs or getting scraped up or not knowing the path back. Point being is I'm going to take it slow, be focused, be thoughtful early on, and then when I get into situations where that's a heavy bar and I need to move, I can do so without having to think about the trail because it's already there. Number 4, early and often success building to an expression of fitness. So somebody should be successful very early and very often when they're learning a new skill, whether that be any video games, sport, skateboarding, anything technical, whatever, training. So if they're early and often success is going to benefit them from a motivation standpoint, and it's also going to allow them to fail safely and progressively move towards an expression of this activity as opposed to, am I doing this right? Now they are just acting and doing the thing as they need to accomplish a task. Those would be my general training principles as well as what I perceive the model to be capable of doing and its limitations. So now I'm going to walk you through on how I would essentially use this to work with a client. So starting off, we're going to look at our standards. This would kind of be the difference of working with an individual versus a group class. So my standards are written out for a group environment, but essentially this is just my script for how I feel a good class would play out. So I'm not going to dig all the way through it, but you're welcome to pause and have a read if you care to see my thoughts on how an appropriate, in my case, CrossFit class plays out. Off to the left here, this is kind of our look at training frequency. So we have minimal sustainable volume, minimum effective volume, maximal adaptive volume, and max recoverable volume. That's kind of how I view training. Minimal sustainable volume will be where I focus qualities that are not the primary concern of the current training model. Minimum effective volume is where I start qualities that are now the focal point of the current training model. Maximum adaptive volume is where I'm trying to lead a minimum effective volume starting quality up to. And max recoverable volume would kind of be a proxy for your maximum amount of work or volume or sets accomplishable in that training phase, whether that be day or cycle, whatever that may be. If we're looking at day of training, I would like to see certain activities performed before others to try and maximize their potential, to go along with my training principle of seek to best replicate the qualities you want to be able to express. So I'm going to do high velocity activities prior to lower velocity activities. I want higher load and lower duration activities prior to lower load and longer duration activities. And I want a higher neurological demand activity prior to a lower neurological demand activity. And I want less safe to fail activities up front and safer to fail activities on the back end. So think of this as a training day. If I'm tired, I probably would rather be doing safer to fail. If I'm fresh and I have a lot of neurological demand available or more attention span available, I can better or more appropriately manage these sort of demands from training. And when it comes to a qualitative perspective there, is that as fast as you can run? Is that as heavy as you can lift? And is that the most accurate you can be as far as trying to define what these are essentially getting at? So these are the basic training principles. We also have a touch on physiology, anatomy, as well as training ranges. So our physiology, this is content that I've derived from Evan Picon. He does a lot of work with a Moxie monitor to be able to understand or read the oxygen saturation in any given muscle, as well as blood flow to that muscle by looking at total hemoglobin. So Moxie monitor will give us a reading in milliseconds time domain and graph on a scale for us so we can see the relationship of blood flow and oxygen utilization in a muscle. So in saying so, all training is lactic and all training is aerobic. So a lot of us understand the energy systems of phosphocreatine, glycolytic, and then oxidative, kind of like your super short, your moderate duration, and your long duration. But what's actually happening is these three are overlapping in the millisecond timescale. So it's not as to say you're in this energy system domain, but they're all being utilized. So when oxygen drops to a 0 point, we also see that PCR is at a low point. So we can see that oxygen and phosphogen creatine is essentially in sync during training. So a 1 rep max back squat and a genuine 30 rep max back squat, that last rep would be the same speed as your 1 RM back squat, because the oxygen saturation in the muscle would essentially be the same. Its low point. So pathways overlap millisecond time domain. When oxygen reaches a low point, there's an increased reliance on the glycolytic pathway, glycolysis, to restore phosphocreatine and then ATP. So it's not like oh, this one's gone, let's switch, but it's they're all working, and when this one reaches a minimum point because it fails sooner, this one has to expend more effort. And then we have our relative limitations. So oxygen delivery limitation, respiratory limitation, and utilization limitation. So delivery. Are you ineffective at delivering oxygen to the working tissues over a long period of time? This could be due to, essentially, you have a reduction in cardiac output if this is your issue, and that can be a multitude of different reasons why. Respiratory limitation, this would kind of be like your ability to get off enough CO2. And then your oxygen utilization, can you actually extract oxygen at the level of the muscle and utilize it to a low point? Typically, muscle tension, so stronger you are, typically this isn't much of an issue. We look at our 0 to 100% of your 1RMs. We're going to see a compression reaction of muscles under 0 to 30. We'll see a venous occlusion, meaning blood flow back to the heart is being occluded around 30 to 70% of your 1RM, and arterial occlusion, meaning blood flow into the muscle is being occluded around 70+% of your 1RM. So what we also see here is that the more capillary density or mitochondrial density you have, the higher up on the 1RM you can be before an occlusion is going to take place. The more hypertrophy or muscle mass or muscle real estate you have, by default, that is going to be less dense capillary and less mitochondrial density, just because you have now more real estate relative to those. You are going to occlude blood flow much lower on the percentage of 1RM. Now, you can also look at a cyclist, for instance. They get a lot of aerobic activity on the lower body, and the upper body is more or less stagnant or isometric during the race or ride. You will likely see that they can get much higher on a 1RM for their lower body before occluding, but their upper body would occlude blood flow, occlude blood flow to the working tissues at a much lower percentage. So in saying so, the upper body for this cyclist is likely to hypertrophy under lower loads than, say, the lower body. So that's how that can be useful for kind of understanding where this can be utilized during training. We do want to make sure that movement capability, movement coordination, and breathing are not a limitation to performance before we try and do any sort of energy system training protocols. It would be silly to try and address a physiology limitation before. Are you skilled enough to even do the thing we're working on? Do you have the appropriate ranges of motion to accomplish this task efficiently? And then can you even breathe here? So if those three aren't accounted for, there's honestly no point in doing any specific training for a limiting factor if one of these three things or any of these things are currently a limiting factor. To touch on the anatomy side a little bit, so this is a typical movement assessment I would use for an individual, essentially a tabletop assessment, kind of PRI concepts. And then if we look at our breathing archetypes. So if we're looking at breathing, exhales do a thing, they compress the body, inhales do a thing, they expand the body. These compressions and expansions are accommodated by different joint range of motions that essentially aid the inhale or the exhale. So when we exhale, we compress, we internally rotate, we adduct, we extend, and we dorsal flex and pronate. Our inhales are accommodated by expansion. These allow for external rotation, abduction, flexion, as well as plantar flexion and supination. Now, when we look at archetypes, these are essentially the accommodations the body is making to manage pressure internally, I suppose. So we have a wide ISA and a narrow ISA, and as Pat or Bill Hartman will put this, the lower ribs are really movable, manipulatable bone structure. So this would be the first signs of layers of compensation for allowing movement. So we have a wide ISA, which essentially would be a wider angle at the sternum, and a narrow ISA, so a narrower angle at the sternum. A wide, you are a great exhaler. You have a wide lateral rib cage dimension and use a rib flare to help you inhale. So you essentially puff up your chest to help you inhale. But you compress and squeeze things really well. These are typically synonymous with people that produce a lot of force or kind of turn their whole body left and right to be able to move left and right. So maybe a little stiffer, but really strong typically. Narrows. You are typically a great inhaler, and we'll end up using excessive musculature to help us exhale. So we're much more of a circle shape type individual, typically mobile or hypermobile people. And yeah, a very round rib cage, whereas the wide is going to be a very oval-like rib cage. Lastly, for principles, we'll talk a little bit about training ranges. So if we were going to be transitioning between qualities, in one phase of training going into another, it would behoove us to try and transition down the spectrum. So for the example of a concurrent program, we would want to move from a speed block to a power block to a strength block to a hypertrophy block to an endurance block, if you're doing all of that for some goal or whatever you're doing. But essentially moving right or left down the spectrum is going to have the least amount of fall off and the most similar activities or qualities leading into the next phase. We want our transitions from phase to phase to be as seamless as possible. So below I put the most accurate domains that these fitness qualities would live in. So speed would be low, low, high. So low load, low duration, high velocity. Power would be moderate, low, moderate. Strength would be a high load, low duration, low velocity. Hypertrophy would be moderate across the board. And endurance would be a low load, high duration, and low velocity. So what you'll see is if you move down or up the list or along the spectrum, is you're never actually skipping a block percentage or group of quality of training. So that's to say you're not going from a low load to a high load. So if you went from speed to strength, you'd be skipping that moderate activity. So if we move down the line, no matter what, load, duration, velocity will move one quality step at a time, again, making it more of a seamless transition for training. That covers training principles. So next we're going to take a look at my client considerations. This will be relatively quick as it's just acquiring what is relative information. We have our client profile on the left. This is my typical consultation form that I'll sit down with individuals prior to training. I like to know how they like to be active. So again, just going to get an idea of environmental constraints or lifestyle habits. What obstacles they're facing, again, constraints, concerns about training should be addressed. What are their actual goals? And how do they think I can actually help them? I also think that's a very relevant question for understanding what the client feels a coach is actually capable of doing. And then you're more appropriate or more able to meet them where they are and work with them how you provide your service. As well as the general biometrics or just general data we like to collect. Again, useful information, injuries, exercise history, things of that nature. On our right, this would kind of be metrics. Again, I'll typically work with CrossFitters, so we like to know a little bit of a lot of things. But yeah, we'll write down what's relevant. So if I don't need half of these, that's fine. If I need to cop or erase and write something new, that's fine. But essentially, we're going to have wherever they currently are, what their goal is, and then our evaluations along the way. And then we'll also get an idea of their training schedule just to see what their volume's looking like, or again, just environmental stuff. Next, we'd have our weekly log. So again, just a snapshot of their day in the life. So it just gives me an idea of some potentially useful metrics, as well as a look at their food and intake and their thoughts on their week. My movement assessment once again, but we kind of covered the details surrounding that. Again, I'll take somebody through a tabletop assessment, get what metrics I feel are relevant towards the movements that they're going to need to be able to accomplish during the training, and then we'll seek to benefit those movements however we feel appropriate. So those are client considerations. Next, we're going to take a look at our programming considerations. Again, this is my if this, then that scenario. So starting off, this is essentially taken from Dr. Pat Davidson's Rethinking the Big Patterns. This allows me to identify movement starting place. This allows a proxy for movement quality, measuring for the training qualities, as well as movement categories for tracking. So essentially, our starting place over here would be the lowest level competency required, whereas the end goals would be the highest level of competency required. So if I want somebody going through a hip dominant activity, where on this chart are they going to land that I can make sure I pick an appropriate exercise where they can most appropriately feel the joint action required, have a center or a stance that allows for an appropriate center of gravity, and can they feel the musculature associated with the stance and plane of motion that they're working in. So another way of putting that, does their head fall through their rib cage, fall into their pelvis, or are we stacked? Are they well braced and center of gravity? And can they feel the muscles, as to say abs and hamstrings during a deadlift, to, well, show that they're competent in that given activity? We would probably have less sensation or feel the closer we get to a higher intensity activity, and I'd want more sensation or qualitative feeling measures the lower intensity the activity is. Quantitative measures, again, this is what we looked at during our speed, power, strength, hypertrophy, endurance qualities. So these are essentially what we're looking at. And then our list of movement patterns, this just gives me categories for defining where movements kind of land. This allows me to track volume for these movement categories. Essentially, I am counting the number of repetitions any given tissues go through under these categories. So I can find where somebody's most competent to train what tissues, and I'm able to track that across a long period of time. Next, we have a little bit of stuff from Evan Picon. So this is his speed preservation test. So this is done with a rower. Essentially, I can have a CrossFit athlete give me a 1K, 2K, 3K, and 5K race PR on a Concept 2 rower, and we'll do a little bit of math shown below, and essentially we plot them on this chart. Based on where they're averaged at, we can give them an A, B, whatever. They'll be closer to delivery limited, respiratory limited, or utilization limited. That's going to be their rate limiting factor for improving their performance. So once we understand that, we can go over to training protocols and say, hey, did that person fall under a delivery limitation? These would be their training protocols. This would be the type of activity it's best performed in. If it was a singular modality, it's best performed 20 minutes, 3 to 5 hours. If it's intervaled, it'd be best doing it at a 40-20. This would be a proxy for kind of heart rate or comfortability or talk test kind of stuff. And then this would be number of sets that can be performed in a given training period or training week. And then these would just be examples of those styles of workouts with the perceived physiological adaptations listed above that would be acquired through this type of training. So if they're delivery limited, if they're respiratory limited, or if they're utilization limited, we have training protocols appropriate for addressing their limiting factor. Now, just because we've established somebody's limiting factor performance does not mean we ignore and go blinder zone and just focus on that one thing. As Evan puts it, you do not fail in an event when your limiter cannot cope with the imposed demand. You fail when you've exhausted all forms of compensation. So, thank you, Evan. Appreciate your work, and yeah, great stuff. Also from Evan is his critical power, so he's got this on his YouTube channel, so you can look up the formulas and stuff, but it's just pretty nifty, useful for training CrossFit clients, so I have this on an assault bike. If you give me a max effort 60 second, 90 second, and 150 seconds on the assault bike, give me the averages of your wattage across those durations, we can plot them, do some math, and then I can give a theoretical time. So let's say 10 minutes, I can supposedly hold 239 watts. If I go up to 20 minutes, this may be a little more representative of our critical power, 206 watts. This math also is going to give us our perceived critical power, but keep in mind this would be my indefinite ability to sustain watts. So I feel that 20 minutes might be a little more accurate for most individuals that need to be at a threshold pace, or at least know their threshold pace. Which is essentially critical power, but again, that's like indefinite, so it's kind of assuming for hours on end. We can also put in perceived watts, so let's say 600 watts, or in this case, let's go 762. It's suggesting I should be able to hold that for 67 seconds. So chances are if I started at 762 watts on the bike instead of 1,000, I could probably do that. But you can see it's pretty close, pretty accurate to what we're looking for. So we can put theoretical time or theoretical power, and we can get an outcome for how long I can hold it, or what wattage I'd be able to hold for that duration. Lastly, we'll just take a look at recovery. So this is essentially what I describe as how much of your environment can you manipulate to best or most accurately require the specimen you want to be. So on our left, another way I've put it is implementing a daily routine that shapes an environment to produce the best you. Don't be the inevitable product of environment that happens to you. happen to your environment. So as humans, we have the potential of actually manipulating our environment to, like I said, produce a different us, or the best us, preferably. So potential habits that could be worth tracking, as they may impact daily mood or just success rate of any given activity. Nutrition, these are some easy staples that could kind of keep most in guide. These are just maybe some useful practices, as maybe some people enjoy them. But yeah, general healthy habits, essentially you're just trying to shape an environment to once again produce the best you. So how can you set up a day in the life that requires the person that holds your goals? So that was my training model. So once again, to recap, we had our training principles, which covered standards, covered my philosophies, my training principles. We talked a little bit about the anatomy and physiology involved with those training principles, as well as qualitative measures for certain fitness qualities. We had our client considerations. So this was essentially our needs analysis, obtaining all relevant information for what we need to look at to push them towards our goals. We had our program considerations, which essentially contained our if this, then that scenarios and allowed for a clear identification of where to start somebody movement category wise and how to progress them, both competency as well as increasing load, duration, velocity, or whatever the goal is. And then recovery was just a look at environmental constraints. How can we manipulate our day-to-day life or environment to once again produce the best us, the thing we want to be? So that was my current training model. I hope it was entertaining to some extent. Once again, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or just criteria or thoughts, please comment down below. I'd love to talk. Once again, just hear your thoughts on the matter. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. Good luck, enjoy the ride, and I'll catch you at some point. Peace out, y'all.